Hello everyone. My name is Caroline Ross. I'm 32 years old. 3 years ago, my parents forced me to sign away my inheritance. Right in front of my entire extended family. They called it restructuring the family assets. But what it really was erasing me. $6.2 million was transferred to my sister while I sat there silently at the table. My mother called me a failure. My father refused to look me in the eye. And the family lawyer watched me sign the document that removed my name from the Ross estate forever. They believed that was the end of my story. But 3 years later, something happened they never expected. Last Wednesday at exactly 8:57 p.m., my phone rang. It was my attorney. And the sentence he said next froze the entire room. Caroline, your father isn't calling to threaten you. He paused. He's calling because his entire project collapses in 72 hours, unless you sign. For the last 4 hours, the only sound in my office had been the scratching of a red pen across blueprints. The headquarters of Titan Ridge Development was quiet that night. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights of downtown Denver glowed beneath thick storm clouds. Inside the room, the air smelled like printer ink and stale coffee. I stood over a heavy oak drafting table reviewing final compliance paperwork for one of our redevelopment projects. Every permit. Every inspection report. Every environmental clearance. 3 years of work had built this company. 3 years of proving I wasn't the failure my family claimed I was. My phone vibrated against the table. The silence shattered. I glanced down at the screen. Ethan Caldwell. My corporate attorney. Ethan never called casually. If he was calling at almost 9 at night, something serious had happened. I picked up without looking away from the blueprints. Tell me the steel shipment didn't fall through, I said. The shipment is fine, Ethan replied. I stopped writing. Something in his voice was wrong. Ethan normally spoke quickly, confidently, like a man who already knew the outcome of every legal argument. But tonight his voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm people use when they're about to drop something explosive. Then what's the problem? I asked. He hesitated. I just got off the phone with Victor Langford. The name alone made my stomach tighten. Victor Langford was the Ross family attorney. The man who had drafted the document that cut me out of my own family. They want to talk tonight, Ethan said. I leaned back in my chair. Tell them no. My voice was flat. Tell Langford to lose our number. I'm not playing whatever game Andrew Ross thinks he's starting. There was a long pause. Then Ethan said quietly, Caroline, this isn't a game. I stood up slowly. What do you mean? The Canyon Crest Project, he said. Your family's flagship development. The lenders just froze the financing. I frowned. I hadn't followed anything related to the Ross family in years. Not their projects. Not their press releases. Nothing. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Let it collapse. It has nothing to do with me. Ethan exhaled slowly. It has everything to do with you. I felt my grip tighten around the phone. The project requires a legal easement, he explained. Emergency access and drainage rights from an adjacent property. Without that easement, the banks won't release over $400 million in funding. Okay, I said slowly. And? There was a long silence on the line. Then Ethan said the words that changed everything. That adjacent property is owned by a company called Silver Hollow Capital. My heart skipped. Silver Hollow Capital was my company. More specifically, a subsidiary of Titan Ridge Development. Caroline, Ethan continued carefully. You own the land their entire project depends on. For a moment, the world felt tilted. 3 years earlier my family had stripped me of everything. Money. Status. Their last name. And now, the success of their $400 million development depended on a piece of land I had bought almost by accident. A cracked concrete lot I used as equipment storage. A property nobody else wanted. The irony was so massive it almost made me laugh. Then Ethan spoke again. Langford isn't threatening you. He isn't negotiating from strength. He sounded desperate. They need a 72-hour extension before the lenders pull funding. 72 hours. A countdown. I walked slowly toward the massive glass window overlooking the city. Denver's skyline glowed against the night. My reflection stared back at me. 3 years ago I had walked away from my family with nothing but a pickup truck and a cheap pen. Now their empire was balanced on land I owned. Behind me, the blueprints lay spread across the table like a battlefield. I pressed my palm against the cold glass and closed my eyes. Because suddenly my mind wasn't in Denver anymore. It was back in Scottsdale, Arizona. Back in a long dining room with a mahogany table. Back to the day my life split in half. The day my mother called me the biggest disappointment of her life. The day they gave my sister $6.2 million. And the day I realized my family had already decided who would win. The message from my mother arrived on a Thursday afternoon. No greeting. No warmth. Just 2 short sentences. We are having a family meeting this Sunday in Scottsdale. Your attendance is mandatory. Do not be late. That was it. No explanation. But in the Ross family, the words family meeting never meant dinner or conversation. It meant decisions had already been made. And someone was about to lose. I left Denver late Saturday night. My old pickup truck rattled down the highway as the mountains slowly gave way to desert. By the time I crossed into Arizona, the air had turned dry and heavy. The sun rose over endless sand and stone, painting the horizon in burning orange light. And the entire drive, a strange pressure sat in my chest. I knew something was wrong. My mother never summoned the family without a reason. I arrived at the Ross estate just before 9 in the morning. Tall iron gates opened slowly as my truck rolled onto the long stone driveway. Everything looked the same as it always had. Perfect desert landscaping. Manicured lawns that somehow stayed green in the middle of Arizona. The massive stone house that had been designed to look less like a home and more like a monument. Power. Wealth. Control. I parked my truck near the side of the driveway, suddenly aware of the dust on the tires and the grease stain on my jeans. Everyone else would arrive in luxury cars. But I didn't care. At least that's what I told myself. When I pushed open the front doors, cold air conditioning rushed over me like ice. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Then I heard voices coming from the formal dining room. I walked toward it slowly. And the moment I stepped into the doorway, I understood. This wasn't a family meeting. It was a trial. The long mahogany table had been cleared completely. No flowers. No plates. No decorations. Just polished wood and silence. More than a dozen relatives were already seated around the table. Aunts. Uncles. Cousins who only showed up for weddings or funerals. All sitting straight in high-backed chairs. Watching. Not speaking. Like a silent jury. At the head of the table sat my father, Andrew Ross, wearing a tailored suit even though it was Sunday. Next to him sat the family attorney, Victor Langford, flipping through a thick leather binder. But the person who drew my attention immediately was sitting directly across from him. My sister. Meline Ross. She wore a perfect ivory blouse, her posture calm and composed. Completely relaxed. like someone who already knew exactly how this meeting would end. And in that moment I realized something. She wasn't surprised by this meeting. She had helped create it. "Sit down, Caroline," my father said without looking at me. He gestured toward a single empty chair at the far end of the table. As far away from him as possible. I sat. The leather chair creaked under my weight. No one offered water. No one asked about the drive. Victor Langford opened his binder. And began speaking immediately. His voice was calm and rehearsed. He spoke like he was reading a legal announcement. He explained that the Ross family was implementing a new succession structure. Assets would be reorganized. Property would be redistributed. Trust funds would be reassigned. I listened quietly, waiting for the part where my name appeared. Then Langford finally said the number. $6.2 million. Cash reserves. Investment accounts. Real estate holdings. All of it would be transferred into the sole control of Melanie Ross, the future steward of the Ross family fortune. My sister. The golden child. I stayed very still. My hands rested under the table. Langford finished speaking and closed the binder. Then he reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a thin folder and slid it across the table toward me. It stopped directly in front of my seat. I opened it. Inside was one document. 3 pages long. A legal waiver. If I signed it, I would permanently give up any claim to the Ross family estate. No inheritance. No assets. No legal challenge allowed. My name would effectively disappear from the family's financial future. I looked up slowly. No one met my eyes. My relatives suddenly seemed fascinated by the walls. Or their glasses. Or the table. Anyone but me. My sister gave me a small smile. It looked sympathetic. But there was nothing warm behind it. Finally I looked toward my parents. "What about me?" I asked. My voice echoed through the room. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He stared down at the table. He couldn't say it. So my mother did. Helena Ross sat perfectly straight in her chair. Her diamond bracelet sparkled as she adjusted it on her wrist. Then she looked directly at me. And said calmly, "You have always been this family's worst investment, Caroline." The words hit the room like a slap. We do not continue funding failure. My jaw tightened. But I stayed silent. She continued. "You abandoned a future in law school," she said coldly. "You embarrassed this family. And for what?" Her voice filled with open disgust. To play construction worker? To stand on dirty job sites surrounded by laborers? You chose a life beneath this family's standards. She leaned back in her chair. You are a liability. So we are managing our risk. The room felt smaller. Heavier. Like the air had thickened. But the strange thing was, I wasn't angry. Not yet. What I felt was something colder. Clarity. They had already decided. This entire meeting was just theater. They wanted me to react. To cry. To scream. To prove their point. To show everyone I was unstable. I refused to give them that. I reached into my pocket. And pulled out a cheap ballpoint pen. I didn't reread the document. I didn't argue. Money didn't matter anymore. Dignity did. I signed my name. One clean stroke. Then I turned the page and signed again. And again. I closed the folder and slid it back across the table. Then I stood up. My chair scraped loudly across the floor. The sound echoed through the silent room. No one spoke. I didn't look at my parents. I didn't look at my sister. I just turned around and walked out. The front doors slammed shut behind me. The Arizona sun hit my face like fire. The heat wrapped around me as I walked down the long driveway toward my truck. No one followed. No one called my name. And in that moment I realized something important. I had just lost everything my family thought mattered. Their money. Their approval. Their future. But I had also gained something. Freedom. I climbed into my truck. Started the engine. And drove away from the Ross estate without looking back. At the time, I thought the worst was over. I believed that if I walked away quietly, they would leave me alone. I was wrong. 6 weeks later, my sister proved something terrifying. She didn't just want to erase me from the family. She wanted to destroy my future too. For the first few weeks after leaving Scottsdale, life was quiet. Painful, but quiet. I moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Denver. The walls were thin. The plumbing rattled at night. And the heater sounded like it was fighting for its life every time it turned on. But it was mine. No expectations. No family pressure. Just space. Every morning I woke up at 4. Coffee. Steel-toe boots. Blueprints spread across my small kitchen table. I spent the days chasing construction contracts. Warehouse renovations. Commercial framing projects. Anything that paid. The work was exhausting. Most job sites were filled with men twice my age who didn't like being managed by a young woman. I had to prove myself every single day. But slowly, things started looking promising. After a month of grinding, I landed something important. A mid-size warehouse renovation project. It wasn't glamorous. But the profit margin would have covered my rent and expenses for 6 months. For the first time since leaving my family, I felt hope. On Tuesday afternoon, the developer shook my hand. "Your timeline is aggressive," he said, impressed. "But I like it." We finalized the agreement. I drove home smiling. 2 days later, Thursday morning, I opened my email. The contract had been canceled. No explanation. Just a formal message. After further internal review, we have concerns regarding long-term project stability and risk management. I stared at the screen. The words felt strange. Those weren't construction terms. They sounded like legal language. But I forced myself to move on. Deals fall apart in business. It happens. A few days later I found another opportunity. A smaller residential framing project. The contractor seemed excited. We spoke for almost an hour on the phone. He liked my approach. We were ready to start. Then 3 days later, he called back. His tone had changed. Awkward. Careful. "I've heard some things," he said slowly. "About liability issues connected to your past projects." I frowned. "What liability issues?" He hesitated. Then said the same thing everyone says when they don't want trouble. "Look. I just don't think this will work." He hung up. That night I sat alone at my kitchen table. The words repeated in my head. Risk. Stability. Liability. Not construction language. Legal language. The same phrases from the cancelled warehouse contract. Someone was spreading something. Something careful. Something vague enough that it couldn't be challenged. But damaging enough that people were backing away from me. I discovered the truth 2 weeks later. It happened at a lumber yard outside Denver. I was loading materials into my truck when an old industry contact recognized me. His name was Daniel Mercer. A quiet title analyst who had worked on a few projects I coordinated years earlier. We grabbed coffee from a vending machine and talked for a while. At first it was normal conversation. Then things got awkward. Daniel kept avoiding eye contact. Finally he sighed. "I shouldn't be telling you this," he said. My stomach tightened. "Tell me what?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "I attended a development dinner in Phoenix last weekend." My heart sank. Phoenix. Ross territory. "Your sister was there," he continued. Meline Ross. I stayed silent. Daniel took a breath. "Someone at the table mentioned your name. They were looking for a project coordinator." "And?" Daniel looked uncomfortable. "Meline leaned in and said your family had to legally distance themselves from you because of complications." "Complications?" I repeated. She implied there had been serious professional issues. He raised his hands quickly. "She didn't accuse you of anything directly. That's the problem." The realization hit me like cold water. My sister wasn't lying. She didn't need to. She was planting doubt. In commercial development, reputation is everything. A single lawsuit can destroy millions in financing. No investor hires someone with rumors attached to their name. Even if those rumors are vague. Even if they're false. That afternoon I sat in my truck staring at the steering wheel. My chest felt hollow. Because suddenly everything made sense. The canceled contracts. The nervous phone calls. The legal language. My sister was quietly poisoning my reputation. Not publicly. Not aggressively. Just carefully enough to make people avoid me. She wasn't trying to defeat me. She was trying to starve me out. Desperation makes you do things you normally wouldn't. So I called someone I hoped might still care. My uncle. My father's brother. He had always been kinder than the rest of the family. He answered after 4 rings. I didn't ask him for money. I didn't ask for favors. I asked him to talk to my father. To tell him to stop whatever was happening. To let me work in peace. There was a long silence. 10 seconds that felt like 10 minutes. Then he finally spoke. His voice sounded strained. "The family is tense right now," he said. "Your father is angry about how you left. And Meline is very protective of the Ross name." Then he said something that felt like a door slamming shut. "Caroline, it would be better if you didn't call again." The line went dead. I sat there staring at my phone. Completely alone. My family hadn't just cut me off. They were actively trying to destroy my future. They wanted me broke. Desperate. Eventually crawling back to them for help. Just to prove they had been right about me. Night fell over the lumber yard. Floodlights flickered on. Long shadows stretched across stacks of wood and concrete. The smell of diesel hung in the air. And in that quiet moment, something inside me shifted. I didn't cry. Crying wouldn't fix anything. Instead, I reached into my glove compartment and pulled out my worn leather notebook. The one I used for project notes. I flipped to a blank page. Then I drew a thick line down the center. On one side, I could have written everything I had lost. But I didn't. I already knew what they had taken. Instead, I wrote something else. What they couldn't take. I wrote. My work ethic. My knowledge of construction law. My ability to read structural blueprints. My discipline. My resilience. My experience on real job sites. Line after line filled the page. The truth was simple. They had taken my money. They had taken my family. They had taken my network. But they hadn't taken my skills. And those skills were enough to rebuild. I closed the notebook, started my truck, and drove into the dark Colorado night. Because if my sister wanted a war, I wasn't going to beg her to stop. I was going to build something so strong, she would never be able to touch it again. 1 month later, a massive storm system hit Colorado. Entire towns were damaged. Infrastructure collapsed. Thousands of people needed emergency housing. And suddenly construction companies were desperate for help. For the first time since leaving my family, opportunity appeared. And I drove straight into it. The storm system that hit Colorado that year was brutal. Entire towns were flooded. Highways collapsed. Power grids failed across several counties. Local governments were scrambling to respond. Emergency shelters had to be built overnight. Damaged buildings had to be converted into medical centers. And construction companies were hiring anyone who knew how to get things done fast. So I packed my truck and drove straight toward the disaster zone. I didn't have connections. I didn't have a reputation anymore. But I had skills. And right now, that was enough. The company that hired me was called Holt Infrastructure Group. They specialized in emergency redevelopment projects, temporary shelters, rapid infrastructure repairs, disaster response construction. The entire operation ran out of a chaotic cluster of trailers in a muddy parking lot. Phones ringing non-stop. Contractors shouting over radios. Blueprints taped to every wall. And at the center of it all was one woman. Sabrina Holt. Sabrina was the founder of the company. A former municipal permitting director who had built a reputation for getting impossible projects approved faster than anyone else in the state. She didn't care about titles. She didn't care about resumes. She only cared about one thing. Results. I was hired as a temporary field coordinator. Basically the person responsible for making sure different contractors didn't destroy each other's work on site. It wasn't glamorous. But it gave me access to everything happening on the ground. On my second day, Sabrina tossed a thick set of blueprints onto the hood of my truck. "Review these," she said. Then she walked away. Most people would have spent at least an hour studying them. 3 minutes later, I walked into her trailer and handed them back. "There's a fire escape violation," I said, pointing at the corridor layout. "The emergency exit path doesn't meet state compliance distance." Sabrina stared at me for a long moment. Then she took the blueprints back without saying anything. That afternoon she moved me from field rotation into the command trailer. The real test happened 2 weeks later. It was 2 in the morning. Freezing rain slammed against the site while we worked to convert an abandoned warehouse into a temporary medical facility. The city had given us a 48-hour deadline. Failure meant people would have nowhere to receive treatment. Everything was moving fast. Until suddenly it stopped. The mechanical contractor stormed into the command trailer, soaked and furious. He slammed his clipboard onto the table. "The project is missing an environmental variance," he said. "No clearance. No ventilation installation. And I'm not risking my license." He threatened to pull his entire crew off the job. 40 workers. Gone. The project would collapse instantly. Inside the trailer, panic exploded. Junior coordinators started arguing. People shouted over each other. Everyone was trying to figure out who had missed the permit. But panic never solves anything. So I ignored the chaos. I pulled a legal pad toward me. And started rebuilding the entire municipal compliance checklist from memory. Because during my years working construction, I had memorized the system. I knew which department handled environmental variances. I knew which emergency bylaws allowed temporary authorization during disaster situations. At 3:15 a.m., I called a regional building inspector. Yes. I actually woke him up. Then I calmly explained the situation. Line by line. Regulation by regulation. Statute numbers included. At 3:52 a.m., a digital waiver arrived in my inbox. Temporary authorization approved. I printed the document and walked outside. The rain was freezing. Floodlights turned the construction site into a glowing battlefield of mud and steel. The mechanical contractor stood near his truck drinking coffee. I handed him the authorization. "You've got 20 minutes, I said. Then your crew goes back to work." He stared at the paper. Then nodded. And just like that, the project started moving again. The next morning, Sabrina called me into her office. Which was really just a small trailer with 2 folding chairs and a coffee machine. She poured coffee into a chipped mug and slid it across the desk. Then she looked at me. "You don't panic," she said. I shrugged. "Panicking doesn't fix permits." She smirked slightly. "When everything falls apart," she continued, "most people start screaming. You start rebuilding." She leaned back in her chair. "I want that on my payroll." That conversation changed everything. My temporary job turned into a full-time position. And under Sabrina's leadership, I learned more in 1 year than I had learned in the previous 5. Holt Infrastructure didn't chase glamorous projects. We chased problems. Abandoned warehouses. Bankrupt retail centers. Industrial zones that everyone else considered worthless. We bought them cheap. Solved the legal nightmares. Then rebuilt them into something profitable. I worked 80-hour weeks. I studied zoning codes until they felt like a second language. I learned how developers used land rights, easements, and infrastructure control to influence massive projects. Because in commercial development, power doesn't always belong to the person who owns the tallest building. Sometimes it belongs to the person who owns a tiny piece of land that building can't function without. At the time, I treated it like an interesting strategy. Just another business lesson. I had no idea that one day, that exact principle would give me control over my family's entire empire. About a year later, Sabrina offered me a promotion. A big one. Strategic Project Executive. I would move from field coordination into high-level development management. Overseeing projects from planning to completion. The salary was impressive. 6 figures. But when I read the contract, I crossed the number out. Sabrina raised an eyebrow. "What are you doing?" "I'll take a lower salary," I said. "But I want 15% of the net profit from every project I lead." She stared at me for a few seconds. Then laughed. A real laugh. The kind that comes from genuine respect. She signed the change immediately. "Welcome to the big leagues," she said. That decision changed my future. Over the next 2 years, I led multiple redevelopment projects. Each one successful. Each one profitable. Instead of just earning a salary, I was building ownership. Eventually, I created my own development company. A legal entity designed to run operations independently. I named it Titan Ridge Development LLC. Titan Ridge became the engine. Construction. Redevelopment. Asset management. Everything ran through it. And slowly, quietly, something incredible happened. The girl my family had called a failed investment was building a company worth millions. By the end of my 2nd year running Titan Ridge, our unrestricted capital reserves had crossed $3 million. Banks returned my calls. Investors started requesting meetings. The industry that once ignored me now wanted to work with me. But even then, I didn't know something else was happening behind the scenes. Because while I was building my company, my sister was still trying to destroy it. And eventually, her sabotage would lead me to discover something extraordinary. A piece of land. A forgotten property. That would put the entire Ross family empire in my hands. For the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully. Not because everything was fixed, but because the truth was finally out in the open. The next morning my phone started buzzing non-stop. Messages. Calls. Voicemails. Some from relatives, some from people I barely even spoke to anymore. Is this true? Why didn't you tell anyone? Are you okay? But the messages that surprised me the most were from people defending me. Apparently the screenshots had already reached my extended family group chat. The same relatives who had quietly believed Daniel and my sister when they painted me as the unstable one. Now they were seeing everything. The flirting. The secret meetings. The lies. And suddenly, the story was very different. My cousin texted me. I'm so sorry. We thought you were exaggerating. Another aunt wrote. They humiliated you. This is unacceptable. Funny how quickly people change sides when evidence shows up. But I wasn't celebrating. Not yet. Because the real reaction I was waiting for hadn't happened. Daniel. Around noon, he finally called. I stared at my phone for a moment before answering. Silence. Then his voice. Angry. Panicked. What the hell did you do? I leaned back in my chair. I told the truth. You're ruining my life, he snapped. I almost laughed. Your life? I said calmly. You mean the one you built by cheating on your wife with her own sister? He didn't respond for a few seconds. Then came the excuses. It wasn't like that. We made a mistake. You're blowing this out of proportion. I had expected that. People like Daniel never admit guilt. They just change the story. You tried to destroy my reputation, I reminded him. You told everyone I was unstable. You made me look crazy. His tone softened slightly. Look, maybe we can talk about this privately. There it was. The moment he realized public opinion had turned against him. Now he wanted to fix things quietly. But that opportunity was gone. You had your chance, I said. And you chose lies. Before he could say anything else, I hung up. A few minutes later my sister called. I almost didn't answer. But curiosity won. Her voice was shaky. You had no right to post those. No right? I repeated. You slept with my husband. She started crying. I thought you'd moved on. That sentence stunned me. Moved on? From betrayal? From humiliation? You destroyed my marriage, she continued. For a second. I just sat there. Then I said something she clearly wasn't expecting. No. You did. Silence filled the line. Because deep down, she knew it was true. And that silence? That was the moment I realized something important. For weeks I had felt like the victim. But now? They were the ones scrambling. The ones explaining. The ones defending themselves. For the first time since everything happened. They were the ones being judged. But the story wasn't finished yet. Because a few hours later, something happened that I never saw coming. And when it did, Daniel finally realized his life was about to collapse. By the evening, things had gotten much bigger than I expected. What started as a few screenshots shared with family had now spread far beyond that. Apparently someone in the family group chat decided to forward everything to Daniel's workplace circle. And once something like that gets out, it spreads fast. Very fast. Around 7 p.m., I received a message from an unknown number. Hi. I work with Daniel. Are these screenshots real? I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because by that point, the damage was already done. Daniel worked at a company that cared a lot about public image, professionalism, reputation. And apparently, being involved in a cheating scandal with your wife's sister was not exactly great for any of those things. A few hours later my cousin sent me another message. Daniel was sent home today. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Not because I felt guilty, but because I realized something important. For weeks Daniel and my sister had tried to rewrite the story. They told everyone I was unstable, jealous, overreacting. But now, the truth had created consequences they couldn't control anymore. Late that night my phone rang again. Daniel. This time, his voice sounded completely different. Not angry. Not confident. Desperate. You need to delete those posts, he said immediately. I stayed quiet. My boss saw them, he continued. This is getting out of hand. Out of hand. That phrase almost made me laugh. You mean like cheating on your wife with her sister? I asked calmly. Please, he said. I could lose my job. For a moment. I thought about all the nights I had cried while they mocked me behind my back. All the times they told people I was crazy. All the lies they spread. And suddenly his desperation didn't move me at all. You should have thought about that before lying about me, I replied. You're ruining everything, he said again. No, I said quietly. You ruined it. And then I ended the call. But the real shock came the next morning. When my sister showed up at my door. Unannounced. Red eyes. Messy hair. Looking like she hadn't slept all night. The moment I opened the door, she started crying again. Daniel might get fired. I crossed my arms. And? Her face twisted with anger. You're enjoying this, aren't you? That question hit harder than she expected. Because the truth was, I wasn't enjoying it. Not really. Revenge didn't feel the way people imagine. It didn't erase the betrayal. It didn't fix the broken trust. But it did something else. It made sure the truth existed. I just told people what happened, I said. She wiped her eyes angrily. You destroyed our lives. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. No, I said again. You destroyed them the day you betrayed me. She had no response. And for the first time since everything began, she finally walked away in silence. But what happened 3 days later was the moment Daniel's entire world truly collapsed. And even I didn't expect it to go that far. 3 days passed. 3 very quiet days. No calls from Daniel. No messages from my sister. For the first time in weeks, everything felt strangely calm. But that calm didn't last long. On the 3rd morning, my cousin sent me a message. Did you hear what happened? My stomach tightened. Daniel got fired. I stared at my phone, reading the message again and again. Apparently his company had called him into a meeting after the screenshots kept spreading online. What started as a personal issue quickly turned into a reputation problem for the company. According to someone who worked there, Daniel tried to deny everything at first. But once they saw the messages, the dates, and the proof, there wasn't much he could say. They told him it was unprofessional conduct and that the situation was damaging the company's image. So just like that, His job was gone. The man who once laughed while calling me dramatic was now explaining to people why he suddenly didn't have a career anymore. But that wasn't even the biggest consequence. Later that evening my sister called me again. This time, her voice sounded empty. "They're filing for divorce." I stayed quiet. She continued speaking through shaky breaths. "He says everything got too messy, and he can't deal with the pressure anymore." For a moment I almost couldn't believe it. The man she betrayed me for. The man she defended and protected. The man she chose over her own family. Was now walking away from her too. And suddenly the entire situation made sense. People like Daniel don't destroy lives because they love someone. They do it because they're selfish. When things get difficult, they leave. My sister cried for a few minutes before finally asking something I never expected. "Do you hate me?" I thought about everything that happened. The lies. The betrayal. The humiliation. But the truth was, hate requires energy. And I was tired of giving them any more of mine. "I don't hate you," I said quietly. "But I'm done." That was the last conversation we ever had. Weeks later, I heard through relatives that Daniel had moved to another city trying to start over. And my sister? She lost more than just a relationship. She lost the trust of her entire family. But as for me, for the first time since everything happened, I finally felt free. Because the truth had done something revenge alone never could. It exposed everything. And sometimes, that's the most powerful justice there is. If you made it this far, thank you for listening to the story. If you enjoy dramatic real-life stories like this, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Trust me. Some of the next ones are even more shocking. Eyes.